Alright, learning objective 3, discuss the function of the Declaration of Independence and how the Enlightenment influenced the document. The Declaration of Independence announced to the world why the colonists felt they must separate from the British Empire. It was an appeal to the world and an attempt to win public understanding and support both at home and abroad. It was a piece of political propaganda that was the main function of the Declaration of Independence. The document implies that it speaks for the majority of the people in the United States, when actually, according to John Adams, only about a third of the American people supported the Revolutionary War. The other third were loyalists, or at least were leaning towards the loyalty to Great Britain. Loyalists just meant loyal to Great Britain. And the other third just didn't care either way. They were too busy paying bills and just living their lives. There's a great film that we might watch called Revolution with Al Pacino. It's not a very well-known film, but it depicts this kind of apathetic one-third of just an average guy who was a trapper, and the revolution just happened, and he wasn't too aware of it, and he gets caught up in the winds of history. Hopefully we get a chance to watch that film. So it's an effective piece of propaganda. This is not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just what it was. You just have to ask, one has to ask themselves, how effective would the document have been trying to gain support for the new government if it stated it only represented support from a third of the people? Thus, in order to gain support for their cause, the Patriots implied that the document had more support than it really did. This was to make an appeal to European state powers like Spain and France, and also to get people within America on board as well, people who might have been sitting on the fence on this or might have been opposed to this. Reading the document, it's a very inspiring document, and so it's an inspiring document now. It was certainly an inspiring document back then. So it did move people to reconsider if they were considering against. The Declaration was also a political justification for events that had already taken place. The American Revolution was over by 1776, and when the war just begins. And the 13 states were fighting the war to preserve what they had accomplished by that date. England was the one that was fighting to gain control over the colonies that it had never really had because of salutary neglect. The Declaration did not advocate that changes should take place. It was an attempt to explain why the 13 United States had taken action that they had. So that basically is the function of it. Now we want to look at how the Enlightenment or natural rights is an influence of it. How was this an expression of natural rights, the Declaration of Independence? So in writing the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson borrowed quite heavily from the Enlightenment, Newtonian principles, and in particular from the writings of John Locke and his natural rights doctrine. Faith in nature and in reason was the common denominator of the Enlightenment. It wasn't a rejection of God, but it was a way of, like atheism is, but it was a way of placing God within the context of the scientific revolution, of understanding God through reason, not through faith, not through tradition. Both Locke and Jefferson accepted the Newtonian world governed by the laws of nature and nature's God. They accepted, too, the idea that reason could penetrate and master the laws of nature, and that reason could persuade people to conform to the axioms or principles of reason in philosophy, ethics, politics, economics, and laws. So a lot of what the Enlightenment was it was standing on the shoulders of the scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution basically said that we can explain the phenomena of this world through reason. We can look, we can observe it, we can have experiments, and we could repeat those observations or experiments and go from hypothesis to theory. And and begin to explain the phenomena of this world through theory, rather than through tradition, through religion, through ritual, through sacred texts, right? So the Enlightenment took the ability of human reason that the scientific revolution did and tried to really apply that to ethics and politics. And basically, if you think about the idea of rejecting the divine right of king, that's all about the Enlightenment, right? Where is that within reason to understand someone has authority over you because they say God, they have that authority by claim of God. That's an article of faith. And so authority, political power is going to be re-examined and looked at, and there's going to be rules applied to it that everyone can agree on, and there should be a rule book. That rule book today is our Constitution. So if we see somebody abusing power, we can all go to the rule book and say, look, you're violating these rules right here, you need to stop that, or here are the said consequences within the rule book, right? So reason, as the enlightened philosophers would argue, makes things self-evident to all educated people. If there is a commitment to freedom of the mind, freedom from religious and social superstitions. These self-evident truths, once discovered, are not only permanent, but universal. So what's reasonable here in McAllen, Texas, should be reasonable in Kosovo, or in Nigeria, or in the Antarctica. Wherever there are people observing this natural world, we should all come to the understanding, that same understanding. So this is a total rejection of anything that has to do with relativism, which is something that comes later. Jefferson's self-evident truths in the Declaration were no more original than were the arguments in Thomas Paine's Common Sense. The Declaration of Independence was itself simply the common sense of the matter. This is one reason why it was so generally accepted and why it was such a great piece of political propaganda. It has been argued that the signers of the Declaration realized these truths discussed in the document were not evident to everybody, either in America or in Europe. That is why they said self-evident or not evident to all mankind, and they were very careful to point out in it that we who hold these to be thus. Reason forces one to ask if these rights were self-evident to, this is the problem with the Declaration of Independence from all right, I'll leave that in. That was my wife calling. And my son really likes the song Iron Man, so I have Iron Man on my phone. Okay, the problem with the Declaration of Independence, and this is a really interesting thing. This is interesting. It's interesting how the Declaration of Independence was edited, and it's very interesting. They're using reason, and people, the political elites of the time really buy into reason, but you have this problem. If things are self-evident and self-evidence is universal, then if all men are created equal, who does that apply to? And this question, once addressed within the United States, is really going to open up this cornucopia of what we now understand as social justice and human rights. And there's no way of putting it back. There's no way of putting it back. It's important to understand, too, that this is just an idea, human rights. It's a great idea. I love this idea. But it's just an idea. There's nothing... It's a very strange idea in the context of civilized humanity. Civilized humanity is anything but civilized. It's a very cruel prospect, and human beings in all civilizations have broken each other up into groups, and the dominant groups have always been cruel to the weaker groups, or the perceived weaker groups. And this has been broken down through the course of American history, beginning with the Declaration of Independence. And it goes back all the way to this point, up until this very second, right? So if we're looking just at African Americans, it's going to be the value of this idea that will keep a lot of the advocates for abolitionism, the African American abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, loyal to the United States. Looking at Lincoln, he was in favor of creating the colony Liberia, which was a colony of the United States in Africa, and sending and freeing the slaves, if the slaves were to be free, and sending them all to Liberia. And Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave, self-taught, probably one of the most famous abolitionists of all time, argued vigorously against that idea. He felt even though he was hated by most white Americans, the ideals, not the reality, but the ideals of America is what he was loyal to, and he wanted to make that happen. And this expectation of human rights for just the mere fact of being human, despite your status, despite your class, despite your race, despite your gender, despite your sexuality, has permeated throughout America, and is really the basis of conservative liberal politics. And we're still fighting this fight. Right now we're seeing this fight still in gender politics, and still in and very vigorously in sexual identity politics. And so we're seeing this fight being played out in homosexual marriage at this point in some states, and the Supreme Court has weighed in on it and basically in favor of it. So again, this is something that is very much with us, and it is a fight because, again, it is just an idea that is wonderful, that just the fact that because you are human, you have inalienable rights. But it's a fight that is not necessarily universal, and it's not necessarily just something that people are born with some sort of understanding if you just reason with them. People have fought, people have died, people have killed, and people have been killed just for the thing that most of us kind of take for granted in many ways, that to be human is to expect to be treated with dignity and decency. All right. Let's get back to John Locke here, and we'll wrap this up. John Locke appealed, just to give you a little bit more background on where Enlightenment came from. In 1688, John Locke, so he's living about 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. He's a person that the Founding Fathers would all read, had gone to college, and have argued about and really appreciated his writing. So he wrote in 1688 an appeal to reason to write the justification for the Glorious Revolution, which was basically an English civil war, which was against King James II for depriving the English people of their natural rights, life, liberty, and, as he put it, John Locke, property. Very interesting that John Locke would use the word property, and Jefferson would change property to happiness. So just take a second to ponder why he would change it to happiness from property. Jefferson purposely using John Locke's ideas and almost plagiarizing John Locke, but changing this word quite purposely. Thinking about the Declaration of Independence, I'll just leave this as an open question. Why do you think Jefferson would change the word happiness, property to happiness? So kind of keep in mind some of the things Howard Zinn is talking about, and this will give you somewhat of an idea of why Jefferson made this decision to change property to happiness in this word. This is also something important to think about. What were the rights, and what do they mean? What does it mean when we say life, liberty, and property, or happiness? Think about this. Name one natural right. Name one. Name one that you have that society cannot take away from you. Name one through legislation and enforcement. Name one right that you have. Right? This is something to think about because essentially, again, they are just ideas. Right? Is there a real claim to human rights within the context of a state, that is, of a political power that, for whatever reason, human beings within that society adhere to. Are there really natural rights within that society? I'm not saying that there are or there not. It's an open-ended question. It's a question that thinking people of this country and thinking people of this world as global citizens have to think about. And if there are, then you have to understand you have to fight for them. All right, over and out. Declaration of Independence. I will see you later on in the lecture for the Constitution. Take care.